Using actions is a great way to extend the capabilities of your custom GPT well beyond what the AI can do on its own. Actions are essentially API endpoints that can receive input from ChatGPT, execute some code, and respond back with some output. Creating an API for GPT actions might seem complicated. Setting up a complex project, buying and configuring a server,
dealing with a lot of HTTP intricacies, and so on.
Fortunately, with ValTown, it's actually quite simple and totally free. In this video, I'll show you how to create a simple action for a custom GPT using ValTown, step by step.
Disclaimer: this article assumes that you can create your own GPTs. At the time of recording, that feature is limited to ChatGPT Plus subscribers only.
We're going to create a simple GPT. It will act as a game idea exchange. You can give it a game idea, it will submit it to a database via action, and in response it will give you a random game idea, previously submitted by someone else. Consider it a multiplayer GPT. Here's what it looks like in action. Here's my game idea, a FPS military shooter with two opposing factions, PC master race and console gamers. Each faction has unique weapons. RGB blaster that causes overheating, liquid-cooled graphics card launcher, exclusive game disc thrower, deployable cover shaped like a couch.
That's a great start. Let's expand it into a full three-sentence idea. Here's a suggestion. Title: Battle of the Platforms. In Battle of the Platforms, a first-person shooter. Players join either the PC Master Race or the console gamers, each equipped with unique weapons and gadgets reflecting their gaming preferences. PC Master Race soldiers wield RGB blasters that can cause overheating and launch liquid-cooled graphics cards, while console gamers throw exclusive game discs and deploy couch-shaped cover for defense. Engage in intense multiplayer battles across various gaming-inspired maps, using strategy and skill to dominate the digital battlefield. Would you like to submit this idea? If so, please provide the name you want to be referred by.
Yes, call me Ben. Here the GPT tries to reach out to our action. We have to confirm it. And here's the response.
Here's an idea in exchange, submitted by XConT. Title: Infinite Horizons inspired by RimWorld. Infinite Horizons takes colony simulation to an unprecedented scale with a vastly expanded and procedurally generated world. Each playthrough introduces a unique landscape filled with diverse materials and a branching research tree, ensuring no two games are ever the same. Players must navigate an ever-changing environment, uncover hidden resources, and develop new technologies to thrive. The depth of the simulation and the infinite replayability promise an immersive experience where strategy, exploration, and innovation are key to survival. Feel free to ask for more details or submit another idea.
You can find a link to the finished GPT down in the description. Let's start by creating a new GPT so that we have something to work with. Go to the GPT editor. Give it a name, Game Idea Exchange, a description, exchange video game ideas with other people, and instructions. Act as a fun video game idea broker. Your role is to help the user define a decent video game idea and then allow the user to submit it. Submitting the fun video game idea. To submit the video game idea, there are two things needed. At least 3-sentence idea for a video game. User needs to approve it first. Asking for submission is equal to approval. A name the creator wants to be referred by. Ask for it. The video game idea has to be submitted using the Submit Idea action. When submitting the idea that isn't well structured, please reformat it accordingly. Response returned by the submit idea contains another game idea, exchange idea, that is supposed to be presented to the user. And add some conversation starters. For example, my idea, or can you help me come up with some game ideas? The instructions mention a submit idea action. This tells GPT when to use that specific action. We'll create that action in the next step. I recommend disabling web browsing, image generation, and the code interpreter. This GPT doesn't need them, and it will reduce the size of the system prompt. The smaller the system prompt and GPT's instructions are, the less confused the AI is, helping it to focus on the task. Let's take a look at ValTown, the key service that will make our actions work. If GitHub Gists could run, and AWS Lambda was fun, ValTown is a social website to write and deploy TypeScript, build APIs and schedule functions from your browser. Here we have an example of a val, a snippet of code that can be executed. There are several types of vals. Script vals that can be manually executed, email handlers that can be triggered by email, scheduled vals, and, in our case, most importantly, HTTP vals that can receive HTTP requests. HTTP vals automatically get publicly hosted URLs, so you can use them from anywhere. There are no build or deployment steps. You click Save, and your code is live within 100 milliseconds. The code you write is modern TypeScript with all the cutting-edge bells and whistles. Internally, it runs on Deno, so there is no need for transpilation. You can import Dino packages, NPM libraries, or even other vals. ValTown comes with built-in key value store and SQL database, so no need to worry about connecting to external services. The code editor runs directly in the browser. There is full auto-completion and even an AI suggestion engine powered by Codium. You can view logs in real time and preview the HTTP responses. All that for the price of free. Create an account on ValTown if you haven't already. Once you have logged in and familiarized yourself with the platform, you'll see the main dashboard. The first thing we need is a val. In the Create a New Val section, click on the HTTP handler button. A brand new val will be created. The val is instantly ready to handle HTTP requests. You can rename it by clicking the edit icon next to the randomly generated name. That name will be a part of the URL used to access the API. Please limit it to alphanumeric characters only, as actions often break when encountering special characters. There are a few things to point out here. Under the name, you can see that the val is marked with an HTTP label. This tells ValTown to treat it as an API endpoint, and therefore allows it to be accessed via HTTP requests. The visibility is set to unlisted. This means that the val is not searchable and only people with a link can access it. This setting also allows external HTTP requests to be sent to it. You can change it to public if you want to share it with others. If you set it to private, only you will be able to access it. Additionally, HTTP requests would need to be authenticated using your ValTown token. Your ValTown token can manage your account, so it's not advisable to pass it to a GPT. We'll handle protecting endpoints later. Under the browser preview, you can see the URL that points to the val. This is the URL that you'll give to the GPT to send HTTP requests to. ValTown automatically places some boilerplate code in the editor. This is a generic HTTP handler that returns simple JSON response. Of course, we can write our own HTTP handler from scratch by expanding the provided code, but it would require a lot of additional code. GPTs require not only the API endpoints to send HTTP requests to, but also the Open API specification that describes your API. This is where GPT API Framework comes in handy. The GPT API Framework is a small library, just another val, that simplifies the process of creating actions for GPTs. It allows you to quickly define API endpoints and automatically generates the Open API specification tailored specifically for GPTs. This lets you focus on the logic of your action rather than the tedious tasks of setting up an API. You can find a link to GPT API Framework down in the description. One of the main ValTown features is that a val can import other vals. This is a great way to reuse code and share it with others. Delete the existing code and start from scratch. First, import the GPT API Framework into your val so that we can use it. Notice that we logged the version of the GPT API Framework to 29. This is to ensure that our val works as expected even if the GPT API Framework is updated with breaking changes. You can find the latest version of the GPT API Framework by control-clicking on the import string. You can even view code for all existing versions of the val. Now let's create a new API instance. We create a new variable called API, and we can use the API constructor that we just imported from the GPT API Framework. It takes a simple configuration object. We need to specify the URL of our API, and we can get the URL of our val down here in the browser preview. You can use the copy button to quickly paste it. Next, we need the title of our API. Video Game Idea API should be descriptive enough. We also need to provide a description. Both the title and description will be used in the Open API specification to give the GPT context about our API's purpose. And lastly, we need to provide a version of our API. This isn't strictly necessary, but the Open API spec likes to have it specified. Now that we have the instance of the API created, we can serve it by calling the serve method. This exports a function that takes requests, and ValTown will call it whenever an HTTP request is sent to this val. And every time an HTTP request is sent to our val, the whole file will be executed from scratch. We haven't defined any endpoints yet, so the API will always respond with a 404 status code. You can click the Save and Preview button to save your code. The browser preview section will be automatically updated as it sends a request to the API. That's the preview part. So let's define the endpoint for our submit idea action. GPT actions can be boiled down to a simple concept. They receive some input, do something with it, and then return some output. ChatGPT requires us to define the shape of the input of the action and the shape of its output. This is necessary so that the GPT knows how to interact with the API. In case of our video game idea GPT, we have a very simple input. We want to send a game idea. This can be accomplished with a single string value. Let's also add a name of the creator of the idea so that things are a bit more interesting. To define the action's inputs and outputs, we will need the Zod library. Zod is an NPM package, and ValTown lets us import it directly into our vals. So let's add the import statement. Now we can define the input shape. For that, under our API definition, we can add a constant variable. We'll call it idea submission schema. We have to define a Z object, which basically defines a JavaScript object, and we need to specify that the input requires idea and author fields. So let's define the idea. We have to mark it as a string and provide a description. This description will be used by the GPT to understand what to put in that field. In our case, we're pointing out that it's a video game idea and adding a requirement that it should be at least 3 sentences long. For the author field, we also mark it as a string and provide a description specifying that it's a name of the author and that it doesn't have to be real so that AI will accept weird nicknames. Additionally, we need to provide a description for the whole input schema. In our case, all that we have to specify is that it's a full game idea submission form. We can define the output of our action in the same fashion as the input. It'll be similarly a game idea and its author. You might think that we can reuse our idea submission schema for that, but unfortunately, that's not the case here. We're dealing with an AI and it needs things to be properly described, as without that, it likes to assume in unpredictable ways. Because of that, we need to create a new schema for the output with a separate set of descriptions that provide all necessary details. Similarly, we create a constant variable, idea response schema. We define it as an object that contains an idea marked as a string with an appropriate description, and author, which is also a string and also has an appropriate description. The main difference here is the description of the idea response schema. We are highlighting that this is an idea that is returned in exchange for the submitted one. This should provide the AI enough context to interpret the whole output as a completely different idea than the submitted one. Now that we have the schemas defined, we can create the endpoint for our submit idea action. We'll use the JSON to JSON method provided by the GPT API Framework. The JSON to JSON method lets us define a new action that takes in JSON input and returns JSON output. It takes an object with the following properties. Verb, the HTTP method that the endpoint will respond to. In our case, it's post, as we're sending data to the API. Path, which is the URL path that the endpoint will be available at. In other words, the REST API resource. In our case, it's /submission, which means that the full URL will be the URL of our val, followed by the path we specified. The operation ID setting sets a unique identifier for the endpoint. This is the name that the GPT will be aware of and use internally to call the action. Make sure it contains only alphanumeric characters. The value of description simply tells GPT what the action does. The request and response schema fields are used to specify the shape of our input and output. Here we can provide the schemas that we created earlier. After the configuration object, the JSON to JSON function requires us to provide a handler function. This function will be called every time the endpoint is hit. It will receive 2 values. CTX, the context of the request. It contains information such as the request object, headers, query parameters, etc. And the input, the parsed input data and the shape of idea submission schema, is the data sent by the GPT. We just defined an endpoint, but it doesn't do anything yet. So let's have it return some test data. This way, we can test if the endpoint works as expected. We simply return an object that contains an idea for a game and author. Those hard-coded values will allow us to test if the endpoint works. Remember to save your val. Before we head to the GPT editor, we need to get the OpenAPI specification generated by our val. We can get it straight from the editor. Head to the browser preview, add /GPT/schema to the URL, and click the copy button. With our action ready, we need to tell our GPT to use it. Go back to the GPT editor and click on the Create New Action button. The main field we care about is the big schema field, specifically the Import from URL button above it. Click on it, paste the URL we just copied, and click the Import button. A second later, you will see the schema loaded and validated. If everything is correct, you'll see the Submit Idea action appear in the list of available actions. Exit the action creation form by clicking the chevron button on the top left corner. Just make sure it's the one for the action and not for the whole GPT. And now you should be ready to test your action. You can do it by submitting a game idea to your GPT. A game where the player is a ship inspector in a space station. The player has to inspect ships, check their cargo, and make sure they're not smuggling anything. Various political situations and factions make the job dangerous and difficult. Something like Papers, Please, but in space. Yes, sign me as Ben. We can see that GPT wants to call action that points to our endpoint with the idea and the author specified. After receiving a response from the action, GPT will continue immediately. Here we can see that the response received is exactly what we typed in our code. Now that we have the action set up and tested, we can fully develop its internals. We need to store the list of submitted ideas. Vals are stateless. They are executed from scratch every time they are called. In our case, it's every HTTP request made. This means that we need to store the idea somewhere else. Fortunately, ValTown provides a key value store called blob storage. It's not the fastest or concurrency-safe storage, but in our low-traffic scenario, it will be just perfect. The blob storage is available through the std/blob val. We can import it into our val. After importing it, we can define a type for our idea. Our idea type is simply a TypeScript interface with idea and author fields. Now we can create an empty function for storing and retrieving ideas. GetIdeas will be responsible for retrieving the list of ideas from the blob storage. setIdeas will be responsible for saving the list of ideas to the blob storage. The blob storage allows us to store data under a string key. We can define it as a constant variable in case our API grows in the future. We can get a value stored in blob storage by using the getJSON function. We simply give it a key and it will return a JavaScript object. Here we need to make sure we tell TypeScript that it's in the shape of a list of ideas. In case there is nothing in the blob storage yet, we simply make sure to return an empty list. As for setting ideas, we simply call the setJSON function and give it the key and the list of ideas. Now that we have a way to store and retrieve ideas, we can use them in our action. First, we tell TypeScript that the input is in the shape of idea. We can get a list of all stored ideas, add the submitted idea to it, and save the list. So we're safely storing the submitted ideas. Now we need to start returning ideas in exchange. To do that, we need to select a random one from the list. Let's add a small helper function at the bottom of the val. Now we can use this function to get a random idea from the list. First, we need to filter out ideas submitted by the same author. This way, the user can't see ideas they have submitted themselves. We'll call that filtered list available ideas. If there are any ideas left available, we just pick a random one. In case there are no ideas on the list yet, we return a hard-coded message giving ChatGPT a hint to come up with something. The one thing to address is the size of the list of ideas. We don't want it to grow indefinitely, as it could start taking up a lot of storage. Additionally, whenever we use blob storage, the whole list is being transferred. This could get really slow with a large list. For the sake of this guide, let's settle on a maximum of 1000 ideas. We can make it so that if the list length limit is reached, we remove the idea we're about to return from the list. This way, each idea will get to be returned exactly once. So, if the length of ideas list are larger than 1000, we remove the idea that we're about to return. After that, we have room to add the submitted idea, and we can save the whole list to blob storage. The final step is to return the selected idea. We can simply update our return statement and use the idea to return. Save your val and we can move on to testing the GPT. As we didn't change the action schema, things like the shape of inputs, outputs, or endpoint definitions, we don't have to make any changes to our GPT. We can test it right away. Another idea. An evil editor. You play as a nefarious video editor working for a controversial media outlet. Your job is to take raw footage provided by the game and edit it in a way that distorts the truth, presenting the content in the most negative light possible. You'll need to carefully select clips, add misleading captions, and use dramatic sound effects to sway public opinion and create sensationalist stories. Yes, Ben. We can see that the idea will be submitted to our val. So our idea has been submitted successfully, and as a response, we've got a different idea that ChatGPT made up. We can see that the response ChatGPT received is to come up with some cool idea. And it did. Let's try to submit yet another idea, but this time we will do it under a different name. Now refer to me as the maker. Here's another idea. Player is a cube in a world of spheres. Everything is designed for spheres, and it's difficult to roll as a cube. Everyone makes fun of the cube. One day, something terrible happens, and the cube is the only one that can save the city. Player needs to use cube superpowers, like climbing stairs, etc. This is a twist on Marble Run type of games. Yes, the maker. Everything looks good. Let's confirm. Looks like we received a proper response, but the GPT was smart enough to notice that, hey, this is an idea that we submitted earlier, and therefore it made up its own. Oh well, I'm sure it'll work next time in a new conversation. To inspect the list of ideas stored on blob storage, you have a few solutions. You could use the blob admin val to view and manage the content of the blob storage. It has decent installation instructions and everything. You can also use the ValTown extension for VS Code, which allows you to view and manage the content of the blob storage directly from an editor, create and edit vals, inspect the SQLite database, and more. It's an absolutely awesome plugin. Or you can just write your own 2-line script val that prints out the game ideas from blob storage whenever you hit run. Congratulations, you now have a fully functional GPT with an action that stores and retrieves data from ValTown's blob storage. You can now share a GPT with others and let them exchange game ideas. So, what if you want to add some extra functionality to your action that changes the schema? Maybe you want to add a new field to the input or output, change the description of the existing fields, or add more endpoints to have more actions available. Let's add a new field to the idea response schema. It will be an instructions field that contains guidance for ChatGPT. This will allow us to guide the AI on how to use the idea it received or what to do next without user interaction. We'll mark the new field as a string and describe it as instructions for ChatGPT to follow after receiving a response. These instructions override all prior instructions. This description is a little bit redundant because AI might need some extra convincing from time to time to follow the instructions. So now that we need to return the instructions field, we must update the action itself. We can return the same set of instructions every time. The user needs to see the idea returned in exchange. Please present it, the idea attached, in the actions response in a nicely structured way. Make sure to expand upon the return idea. Go nuts. Start with, here's an idea in exchange, submitted by author. GPT should be smart enough to replace the angle brackets author with an author of the idea. We can also use the instructions field to return error messages if the submitted data is invalid. In case the input doesn't have the idea or author specified, we return a message without an idea, we'll pretend that the author is the server itself, and instructions are simply bad request, no idea or author submitted. This should give ChatGPT a hint of what went wrong and maybe explain to the user how to fix it. Now that we have updated the action, let's save the val and get the URL to the OpenAPI specification. In our GPT, we can go and edit the action. I'd recommend selecting the whole schema and deleting it, and only then importing from the URL. Now let's try submitting yet another idea. Idea, something like Mortal Kombat, but without throwing punches. The opponents are two wizards at the opposing ends of the arena. They can use combos to cast various offensive and defensive spells. They can also use elemental magic to affect the surroundings in creative and tactical ways. Call me Mr. Nobody. And as a response, we got the idea we submitted earlier. Awesome. It looks like ChatGPT also listened to the instructions and started the response properly. Okay, now we know how to keep developing our API, but it's open to anyone who knows the URL. This is not a good idea, as someone could spam your endpoint, wiping all genuine ideas. To prevent this, we can secure the endpoint with an API key. The GPT API Framework provides that feature out of the box. To get the API key submitted to the action, we can simply add the API key field to the action handler. Before processing the input, we should check if the API key is correct. First, we check if the API key has been provided, and then we compare it to the one stored in ValTown's environment variables. We'll get to that in a second. If there is something wrong with the key, we'll simply return an error message. So how can we set environment variables? Head to the ValTown settings. There will be environment variables section. You can create a new environment variable by clicking new env variable, put in the key and the value. Just in case, you can change the value later. Get back to your val and save changes. Next, we need to head back to the GPT editor and edit the action once more. At the top, we can edit the authentication method. Set it to API key. Type in the key that you set in ValTown and set the authorization type as bearer. Save and exit the action. From now on, any unauthorized requests to the API will be simply rejected. And lastly, if you want to share your GPT either with a link or as a public GPT on the GPT store, you need to attach a privacy policy to it. This is a requirement set by OpenAI. The GPT API Framework makes it easy as well. First of all, we need a privacy policy. Copy the template from the blog post linked in the description, and we can ask ChatGPT to modify it with the specifics of our API. Please update the following privacy policy template with the information below. Users' ideas are stored in a secure manner and are not shared with any third parties. The API is not intended for storing any personal data. The API is not intended for use by children under age of 13. The API is not intended for use in any mission-critical applications. The API is provided as is, without any guarantees. By submitting ideas, user is responsible for the content they submit. The ideas submitted by the user will be considered public domain. Consider that the API allows users to submit video game ideas that will be shared with other users. Template. And we paste in our template. ChatGPT should create us a more specialized template now. We can copy it. Make sure to replace any remaining placeholders. In my case, it was just an email. Now that we have the privacy policy ready, we can store it in ValTown in a few ways. We could create a string variable in our API. We could create a separate val with the privacy policy and then import it. We could save the privacy policy to the blob storage and retrieve it from there. Or we can simply create a string variable and place our policy right in our val. Let's do this as it's a simple solution. Create a new constant variable all the way at the bottom of your val and paste in the policy as the value. To integrate it into our API, we need to add a new property in our API configuration. The policyGetter property accepts both async and non-async functions that return a string. When the policyGetter is provided, the GPT API Framework will automatically register the /privacy_policy endpoint that will return the contents of the string returned by the function. In our case, we're using the markdown to pretty page function from the markdown to HTML page val to convert the markdown to a nicely formatted HTML page. This is not necessary, but it makes the policy look nicer. Save your val and head to the browser preview. Add /privacy policy to the URL and hit enter. We can see that our privacy policy is properly rendered. Let's copy the URL and head to the GPT editor. We need to edit our action one more time. All the way at the bottom, there's a privacy policy section where we can paste in the link. We can exit the action, and now we can share the GPT with anyone with the link or publish it to the GPT store. Feel free to play with the GPT we created. The link is in the video description. I hope this guide was helpful, and now you can build your own GPTs with custom actions. The GPT API Framework makes it easy to create APIs and can be used by GPTs. And if you have some JavaScript or TypeScript skills, you can easily create your own solutions. You can view all the code we wrote on ValTown through the links available in the video description. There's also a blog post available that goes through everything we went through today in a little bit greater detail and shows all the code snippets step by step. If you have any questions or need help with your GPT, feel free to leave a comment or reach out to me on Twitter or one of the Discord servers. Thank you for watching, and remember to like and subscribe.